Welcome back to Data Talk. We're so happy to have you. How have you been holding up during these tough times and working remotely and your whole experience being remote now?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me back. I really enjoy, our chat. I think, like everybody else, we have been all impacted by the pandemic. It's very sad, what's happening, but it's also, good to see that hopefully there is light at the end of the tunnel, and with the vaccination program and everything, hopefully things will get better. Um, Obviously kind of like have been working from home a lot with the lockdowns and everything. And I think just this pandemic has given us the opportunity to use technology more often, which is like a big component of digitization and the digital journey of companies.
Jamila, what was the transition like when I know here in the States, we got the notice around March that we would start working remotely, and all of a sudden, all of our teams we went home and we had to figure out the best ways to communicate. And at the time, everyone was using like WebEx or Zoom, and it was kind of overloading systems in the beginning. When you first transitioned to having everyone work remotely, how was that for you?
I think it's very similar. So we just like jumped into kind of using, tools such as Zoom and, Microsoft Team, tools, trying to find like, ways to share files and, to communicate together. Um, I think from my perspective, because most of the job we do is advising and helping businesses apply AI, which means that most of the work we can do virtually anyway, but it's still tough not having that face to face, physical connection with clients. But it takes some adjustment.
Yeah, so true. And did you find that the types of projects you worked on did they change at all like once COVID started?
Absolutely. So whereas before we used to get involved more in type of edgy type of AI application. Once the pandemic hit, it was more towards efficiency and how to reduce cost, and it was more on the efficiency side because it becomes like a must-have. Whereas like the edgy type of fancy AI becomes like a nice to have rather than must-have.
What were some of those projects?
So it was mainly looking at efficiency, how to automate, some of the tasks, that they have.
Fantastic. And given that subject, what are some of the future trends that you're observing in AI that would be helping businesses be more efficient and helping, the general public? What have you observed?
Yeah, so there have been some themes, sorry, that have come through, going through the pandemic. So obviously, we've seen a lot of application of AI in healthcare, and we can go into more details into that. But we also have seen some major supply chain disruptions, throughout the pandemic. So one of the growth area and trends in AI going forward will be, AI in supply chains. So how to use AI to predict the bottlenecks in the future, and how can use AI to make the supply chain run smoothly, reduce kind of like the gap between supply and demand, optimize the price, the pricing of a product. But we also have seen a rise in AI in retail. So suddenly, because of the pandemic, everything went virtual, and we've seen e-commerce, really growing throughout this period. And obviously, AI plays a critical role in that, in terms of optimizing the marketing campaigns, knowing which product to recommend to which customer. AI has played and will continue to play a role in that. Another area of growth we've seen in the combination of AI and intelligent or autonomous agents. So, for example, we've seen robots deployed at hospitals. We've seen drones, delivering goods. drones, checking whether people are adhering to, to the distance that they need to adhere to. So we will see a lot of combination between AI, robots, drones, going into the future.
Oh, that's super cool. I wanted the second thing you said around the bottlenecks and supply chains that impacted all of us as we went to the stores, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, where we were seeing certain items like just you couldn't find them. I'm thinking of like cleaners like Lysol, things like necessities like toilet paper. Like there were certain things that were happening, these bottlenecks that were happening that affected everybody. We're like, what is going on? As you were kind of like living this out and seeing this happen in real time, how is that impacting you and your own work?
Yeah, so we've seen, obviously, also here in the UK, we had seen some major bottlenecks in supply chains. Obviously, number one famous item was toilet paper. You couldn't find it in any of the stores, but it was also at the medical side. So, for example, the face masks. Suddenly there was a shortage even at the medical, site. But in terms of the AI work, so we've seen more requests from company to do more work in terms of the looking, analyzing their supply chains using AI.
What have been some of the unique challenges around digging into uh, these problems that the pandemic has caused on the supply chain, and how you've been using AI to help?
Um, some some of the challenges which are common really to any AI project is to do with the data. We all know that AI thrives on data, so you really need to have a lot of data. But not only the quantity, you also have to have a good quality data. So with supply chains, most often the issue we people encounter is to do with so when a company use suppliers, usually obviously they have the data around the suppliers because they have to approve the contracts and the audits and everything. But most often the records will so they will have records data on the supplier, but the records will show, for example, the head office. So you might find supplier A will have like a head office, I don't know, let's say in the US or in the UK, but you wouldn't necessarily have the data where the product is being manufactured. So the head office may be in the UK, but where the stuff is happening is not in the UK, and that type of some that type of information could be missing in the data record. So obviously that also kind of like make the analysis harder because you are making it in something that is not really reflecting reality. So that's also a lesson that like when you hold the data, don't only hold data on like headquarters, central groups. You also have to hold like records on like the manufacturing sites and where they are from a supplier perspective.
That's like super like complicated and can be very frustrating to any data analyst, data scientist trying to work with this data, encountering these issues. What recommendations do you have for any data scientist or analyst who is working with these challenges?
Yeah, so one of them is obviously try to get as much good data, throughout cleaning. If there are gaps, try to find like other ways to fill in, those gaps. But also in terms of supply chain, it's so big, there are like so many, excuse me, factors affecting. So there could be obviously economic data that affects, but there is also like political market, that. So maybe if the problem becomes too big, try to cut it down in smaller problems. So rather than look at the overall picture, you might start by looking at some aspect of the problem, and then you build it until you get kind of the overall picture. So sometimes it's easier to cut it into smaller pieces.
And like, what about like those unexpected things that happen? Obviously, COVID-19 was unexpected. That impacted everything, but also things like weather, like that can disrupt supply chains in certain regions. How does a data scientist work with disruptions you're not
Yeah,
expecting?
I guess it comes back to, you know, us as a human and how we deal with uncertainty. So I know that most of us think that obviously COVID, you know, there was uncertainty around COVID, but like, was COVID really a black swan? Like, my answer is no, because there have been a lot of people talking that, like, you know, there will be a next major thing. So the problem is not really in the not knowing or the uncertainty, because there have been some people, you know, some researchers that have hinted that something like this could happen. It's all about kind of not having enough information to plan for it. So the main issue was around the planning and the preparation, rather than trying to forecast the event, because we can never forecast the exact event. So I think it's the same thing that happens with supply chain. You could argue that you could have, like, even weather prediction, you cannot kind of forecast the exact thing when it's going to happen, but you could know, you know, some themes around, you know, we all know that climate change is happening, and we know that, like, we will have, like, in the future, more droughts or more you know, more severe storms. So it's not about knowing the exact bit, it's more about preparing for some sort of scenarios. So my advice is, start thinking in terms of scenarios, and start thinking about being prepared in this type of scenarios.
What have been some of the like questions that have been unique from senior leaders this time as you're consulting, working with all these different companies, talking to senior leaders about their issues? What have been some of the things that maybe questions you've been getting from them or things that you've been focusing on to talk with them about?
Yes, I think kind of now all senior leaders are thinking about any type of event that could have, like, a major consequence, or you know, could be a major disruption to their business. So it doesn't matter the nature of it, as long as it has the capability to disrupt the you know, the business, then it is a problem. So it's all now kind of, the trends is talking about having robust plans, you know, having flexibility to move from plan A to plan B to plan Z. You don't know what's going to happen. As long as you have some flexibility to move around, you know, a certain structure. The other thing is around having redundancies. I don't mean, you know, in the term of making people redundant, but in the term of making components and plans redundant. So you have, like, plan B and C and D. It doesn't matter which one, you know, to pick, as long as if one fails, then you have another one. So it's more about building those you know, kind of you know, plans into their operations. That has become an important you know, piece for senior leaders.
Absolutely. And we've also covered a lot of the challenges that surround AI right now and that are coming with recent events. And I just wanted to know, what are some of the achievements that have happened in the AI world?
That's a great question. So there have been some achievement, kind of like caveat breakthroughs type of achievement in 2020. One of them, I'm guessing most of people have heard of GPT-3, which is basically you know, one of those big transformer languages where you can generate text. So that's based on deep learning, but it's like so big that it has like billions of parameters, and you can ask it a question and it will generate for you an answer. So that's one of the big achievements in 2020. The big caveat, I want, you know, to always, you know, bring like a balanced judgment. So whereas this is like has been one of the breakthroughs for AI in 2020, we are still a long journey towards achieving, you know, a good quality AI intelligence. So even within that achievement, it's important to mention that there are like some constraints and limitation within that model. So that model still, you know, cannot spot bias. So you still get like some biased kind of answers through that. And that obviously that needs to be ethical bias issues that needs to be sorted out. The other issue that I'm really kind of advocating for is when you look at these big models, they're not really sustainable. So for example, the carbon footprint or the training costs has been in millions, terms of, order of magnitude. So this is obviously not sustainable, from a climate change, planet, Earth perspective. So the electricity, kind of needed to generate a model such as GP3, the carbon footprint is equivalent to driving to the moon and back.
Wow.
So
Wow.
my yeah. So whereas I would like to acknowledge those achievements, I'm also kind of advocate for finding new ways for AI, new type of algorithm that are sustainable, that takes the climate change and the carbon footprint into account. Another achievement was from DeepMind with to do with the folding of proteins. So that's kind of what they have labeled as like a 50-year problem, where scientists have been trying to model proteins and how they fold, because that's kind of instrumental in terms of understanding the mechanism of protein folding and structure. So DeepMind was able to launch recently, just like a couple of months ago, their model, which was successful in terms of predicting the protein folding structure. Again, another major breakthrough from DeepMind. But again, I would like to bring some balanced judgment. So whereas has been held as a breakthrough, it is noted that it only works for some specific proteins. So if you take it to the real world and if you give it some more complex proteins, the model sorry then fails to kind of like handle these. So it's another step in a good direction towards the future, but still a long journey to fix how to really model a real complex world problem.
Wow. You mentioned, Jamila, GP3 development and your
Yes.
concerns over bias. Can you talk more about that? Because I'm not aware about that at all.
Yeah, so I tell you what I know. Obviously, I don't know all the details because I haven't been involved in development of the project. So, like any other AI tool, we know that AI, has the ability to amplify the bias. It doesn't mean that the tool is biased in itself. It's so because those models that generate languages, they have been trained in text, and that is found in the web. So through Wikipedia, through whatever is in the internet, those models start basically training themselves, because we know that the web is full of bias, whether it's like unconscious bias, or it's like a a bias in itself. Those text has been kind of coming through the GP3. So I haven't tested it, but the expert that have tested it. So for example, if you you ask a question around about um, Muslims, or like Islam in really, in general, then the model GP3 language model will probably give you answers that could be biased towards Muslims. So it will directly start talking about terrorism, for example.
Mm.
There have been other application. If you use how to say, like a language that doesn't use like she he, so they don't distinguish between female and male, and use like Bulgarian, Oriental, like many languages that they don't distinguish between male and female. And if you gave it to it to translate, so if you say a doctor, the he she become he in the translation. If you use if the that foreign language is about secretary role, then it becomes she. in the translation, because
Mm,
that's kind of what is most often found in the web. There have been also cases where it's been discriminatory towards black ethnic minority people, where it gives like bad annotation to this ethnic minority. And also there have been some weird question where if someone I don't know, ask about a death or suicide, then you get awkward responses from the model where it tells the person, yeah, go and kill yourself, or something like that.
wow. Wow.
Obviously it doesn't happen often, but there have been if you test it enough, you get like these cases. But yeah, in the wrong hand, if you are suffering from mental issue and suddenly a model tells you go and kill yourself, that's really not good.
Right. And you're digging into like some of the moral, ethical issues that these AIs, like as data scientists are developing these algorithms and these AIs, because they're having to make some moral judgments. And that's where it can get very complicated. Like, for example, if you are talking to a Siri and
Yes.
Siri's listening to us all the time, and if Siri's detecting maybe violence happening in the home, does that AI have a responsibility to contact, right, like government, police, hospitals? Like, there's always like very complicated issues that come into this,
Yeah.
and also like you were saying, like what's really sad is because sometimes the training sets, the data that the AI is crawling and using can be biased. So therefore, like you're saying, the technology itself is not biased, but the training data that coming in can be biased, which is then informing how it's communicating.
Yeah, so it's like a very big area for AI, ethics and bias, because the bias can come from different sources. Obviously, the biggest source is the data, but it can also come from the people who develop the systems. Um, so you have to really have like some principles and some framework and some standards on how to go about that. So obviously cleaning the data, I think kind of like, first of all, people need to be aware that bias exists, because that's you need to first acknowledge it before you can do something about it. So acknowledging it is like a first step. And we know from experience, even from a cost perspective, it's always cheaper to address ethical and bias issues at the beginning of the design rather than at the end of it. We've seen like big companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, who went into trouble. For example, we know that like the Amazon recruitment tool that they built, and they found out that it was biased towards women. For some the same type of CV application, the algorithm was giving the job to the technical role to the men versus the women. But kind of the answer of those companies, most of the companies, once there is a problem, a bias with the tool, they will just shelve the tool. We've seen it with Amazon shelving the tool. We've seen it with Google, with first with their facial software recognition, because it's very difficult to sort out the problem and expensive to do it at the end. So it's more about kind of bringing all those things at the beginning of the process. That's the way, on the best way to tackle them. But yeah, it's very complex. We also need the regulation. The regulation is not there. And the same thing, you ask about Siri, hearing something in the background, and the moral maybe duty to act and maybe kind of tell someone to do something about it. But it's the same questions we have around driverless car. So if like a driverless car gets into an incident and someone dies, who is responsible? Is it the manufacturer who manufactured the car, are. Is it the AI software who developed the AI software? Is it the person who was training the AI software during the training process? Who is it responsible? So there are like a lot of issues that need to be addressed, but unless we all get together, so it's the industry, it's the regulators, it's the academics, we need the whole ecosystem getting together to sort out all these issues. So sorry, there is no straight answer to it.
No, definitely. And it's absolutely true that there are so many people who have no clue that there's such bias in these search algorithms, in these artificial intelligence models. And on the thoughts of the advancement of AI technology in general, do you have you seen a rise in fear of if this artificial intelligence is going to take over the workforce or remove or take away jobs from individuals? Um, have you seen that? And is there a way to dispel this fear in any kind of way?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So especially kind of let's say 5, 6, 7 years ago, when kind of like the AI was starting to get back to the scene, we've seen, and we still see it in the media. We see often like a lot of articles, newspaper, like news, talking about AI taken over like jobs, and people made redundant because of the introduction of AI. So that's definitely a fear in that, but it has been also realistic. We've seen some redundancies. I think just to bring some balance. So I think it will be a complete lie to say that AI is not going to have an impact on the on the job side. There will be impact and some impact, but at the same side, it's also good to acknowledge that the introduction of AI will give rise to a new type of roles. So you will get rid of some of the roles, the mundane, the repetitive, the admin type of roles, but you will get like new type of roles. And so I think for me, things will balance out. For me, the fear is not to do anything but training people, because the people made redundant from kind of losing, the job they were doing, it's not just on its own. You have to train them because there will be another role for them. My fear is that those people wouldn't have the skills to take the new roles, because the new roles will be to do with digital roles. So they will need people who knows technology. They will need people who excel in the anything that computers do not do. So for example, emotional intelligence, relationship skills, all that, we need to train our people. We need to train the kids in school to get those new skills, and I don't see a lot of this happening. So that's kind of my fear. If we don't have enough training on those new future skills, we may have problems in the future.
Yeah, and I think you're speaking to like just how important it is for all of us to just be hungry to keep growing, to have that mindset that we want to keep growing, keep reskilling as technology is changing, as things are evolving. I mean, I just look at just in the space we're in social media, how the platforms are constantly changing, the tools we use are constantly changing. We can never get comfortable with one tool because it's always going to be evolving. And I even think about some tools that I was really, really, really good at and certified in with Google AdWords, 10 years ago. And if I log in today, it's completely different. And so, like, just being constantly hungry, constantly trying to learn is going to be super important for this next generation coming up, including our own generation.
Yeah, I totally agree, Mike. I think the key word here is learning, and keep learning, basically.
And essentially, what you're saying is there's going to be certain roles that artificial intelligence will not be able to replace. Um, and yes, it's definitely correct to say that there are going to be certain advancements that we won't require individuals to do, but we're going to always need individuals to, like, physical human beings to be there there will always be a role for us.
Absolutely. I think you're right, Destiny. I think maybe one thing to highlight, and I think we can relate to both because we are both women. So, one issue that maybe it's worth highlighting to the audience. So, depending on which sector you are in. So, a great example will be banking or the financial service, especially banking. So, what you find that a lot of those repetitive task, if you go to the bank, to the clerk, and you queue, most of those repetitive admin tasks are being done currently by women. So kind of you could think that like by AI automating this mundane repetitive task, it will have an imbalanced impact on women versus men. Obviously we cannot generalize it because it depends on which sector you are in, but that's an example of a sector where maybe women could be at the disadvantage if they don't train for the future.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah,
Mm,
like being just hyper aware of how certain industries might be more female dominant or male dominant, and how AI is going to disrupt that potentially, and or how AI can help assist those people so they can do other tasks or work even more efficiently. Yeah, that's really interesting, and I love Jamila, how you're talking about how like kind of those human skills that are unique to humans, emotional intelligence. I'm thinking about things like right now we're all talking about mental health and how people are
mm,
doing during COVID-19, and a lot of people are reaching out to therapists and psychologists during this time. And I was talking to my daughter this last week. My daughter was like, "How come all the psychologists are women?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't think that's true. I think it's probably pretty balanced." And I started to like Google and like look at the stats, and it was true. It was about 75% of psychologists are women. And then I was looking at like who's graduating with degrees in psychology, and it tends to be 75% women. And it's almost like when you look at psychology versus the technology field, it's like flip flopped. Because in tech, it's like 75% male tends to be, 25% women, and in psychology, the opposite. And I was like, oh, it's so interesting. But at the way we're going with like emotional intelligence, human connection, like all that is something AIs can't do. And also, some people don't feel comfortable dialoguing with an AI. They'd rather talk to a person. I think about like from a customer care perspective, if I'm having a trouble with like an Amazon package, I want to like talk to a human about my specific issue. Um, and so, yeah, that's so true. Like the importance of, as we're moving on with AI, and AI is going to be replacing some types of jobs and assisting many others with their work, how important it's going to be for all of us to be working on the EQ skills, the human connection skills.
How can women, since you mentioned that there could be a drastic change for women in the workforce with this advancement of technology, how can women be prepared for this global shift, and how can that knowledge be put out there that this is happening, like how can we get ready for that?
yeah, I think the obviously the most obvious reason is to get more women into technology. That's one way you sort it. But obviously before you get them into tech, I think one of the major issues why we have few women in the tech space comes from the education, from STEM. So actually I'm not sure the situation of the US, but in the UK, you know when you look at the stats, we have like more boys compared to girls, taking STEM education. So that's anything to do with especially maths and science, especially mathematics. So I think we need to solve it at like the educate, the school education. If we can go like more girls into STEM education, that will be one route to get them into technology. The other one is, and I cannot stress it enough, not just for women but also for ethnic minority, most of the time people raise the issue that there is a lack of role models, whether you are like a girl, whether you are like coming from an ethnic minority background, you don't see a lot of people who look like in this take working in tech or taking senior roles. So we need a lot of more of those role models, a lot of mentoring schemes. Hopefully that could all help with the situation.
100%, and I can absolutely relate to that. And I think it's really true what you're saying. It would definitely start on the in the education sector, and just having it be more, normalized and prevalent for women to be in STEM roles. Because what's going to happen is if that is introduced in this generation, it's only going to reflect to the next generation of women, because there will be more their parents, their mother, their aunt will be, gone into a STEM field because it was so accessible in their in high school or in middle school, as early as middle school for them. Because it also goes to the subject of disadvantaged communities in America. There
Mm.
might not be as many resources to have um, STEM programs, more advanced programs for minorities and minority women. So once we start there, I think there would definitely be a huge increase in interest of women in STEM fields, and especially women minorities. It's so, so crucial.
Absolutely, and I think this it's kind of a win-win situation. So, win for like the women and the ethnic minority background because they get into that space, but it's also a win for the technology, so the tech giants. Because if you think about it, if the tech giants had already a diverse teams, they wouldn't sort out all the ethical bias issues they have, but they will at least address most of them. So I'm assuming kind of like if the Amazon I'm just like speculating, because obviously I don't work with the in these teams, but if like the Amazon team had like maybe more women in their the team who developed the the recruitment tool, maybe they could have spotted that the tool is biased towards women, maybe. The same question goes to Google when they did the facial recognition. If they had like more like ethnic minority, maybe kind of they would have noticed that like the facial recognition software is biased towards like black people and other ethnic minority groups. So by having diverse groups, that the tech giants could address some of the ethical bias issues they have. Not all of them, but some of it.
Such an amazing point. I definitely agree. These a lot of these biases are just from generational differences, and what has happened in the past, and who it's in these technological fields, who's working for these tech giants right now. Over time, it has led to these biases. So that is an amazing point. Thank you.
And that brings up a really good question around what are some things that you would like to see our tech community doing more of to help advance women and also people of color into more senior roles in tech organizations?
That's a very good question, Mike. So there are like two steps. There is obviously getting the women in the space, and I think we just spoke about that through kind of mentoring and role model, and maybe some campaigns, education, sponsoring, maybe doing some scholarships. But another key question is, once these women gets into the field, you also need to find a way to progress them through their career ladder. There is no point into getting them and then for them to find themselves stuck in there. So there is kind of like the where is the inclusion once you get in. I think kind of like doing more in terms of looking into kind of how to have like some employment type of regulation, obviously with women have some flexibility in terms of working, so they can, for example, if they have kids, so they can juggle between, looking after the kids and, working, maternity leave. So there are like so many things that they can do to help women kind of like balance their work and having a family life, for example. There are like some other companies who opt for example, quotas. It's kind of controversial whether kind of like you should have a quota or not. Me as a woman, I would like, I will feel prouder if I know that a company have selected me for my skills rather than for a quota number, because it just happened that that they could tick as a piece of paper. So it's all about looking at ways to help women progress their career once they are in the role.
Yeah, I think you're speaking a lot to like the importance of mentorship in organizations, that it's not just about getting a certain number of a certain minority group into your company. It's about how are you helping to raise this generation up? How are you training them up? How are you getting them connected with the right leaders so they can be mentored properly? Because that's like super important. Like that's how you make changes in the organization. It starts with the mentorship. It starts to relate with the relationships. That is like so true. And also like what you just said there about just being aware of how certain groups might be impacted by their children. I think about just the Asian community specifically during this time, where there's a lot of anti-Asian racism that's been happening. There's a lot of trauma, re-trauma that's happening. And then many Asian families have multi-generational homes. And so many of them can't go into the office because they don't want to get COVID-19 and bring it back to their elderly parents or also their children. And so there's like these very unique situations that are happening within certain ethnic groups. And if other groups aren't aware, they're like, well, why aren't you getting this product done? Well, it's like, well, I can't because I have this situation, or I can't come in the office today or this month because of this particular issue. But it takes like awareness as well.
Absolutely. I think awareness and being open to listen and hear different perspective. I think that's the way we can all grow and work together.
Yes, and it's extremely important for these big companies to have a workforce that reflects the nation, reflects the diversity. And it's one thing to just have a seat at the table and not have a voice at the table. It's that is how we lead towards change, and more companies can be, stepping up and having huge diversity initiatives, and that will lead to a butterfly effect, I believe, of change of diversity in organizations, because it has to reflect who they're serving. Like that is extremely important, especially in the technological field.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth highlighting that obviously it's not just a question of doing it because we have to do it, but it's also, it makes sense from even a business perspective to do it. So, even when you look at purchasing power, so we know, for example, women, purchasing power, has been increasing. So if you are in the business of selling product or stuff, you have to kind of have a face that is kind of can relate to the people who are buying. So if like the people who are buying are women, you should have women in your business, because that's kind of how you can understand who you are buying to. And the same thing for kind of other ethnic minorities. You have to understand the market, and the market nowadays reflect a diversity of people. So you need to have that diversity to succeed in business.
1,000,000%, absolutely. I wanted to know if, like, as far as COVID-19, like going back into that sector and artificial intelligence, are there any ways that like in the technological field that there's any AI developments to help with combating COVID-19? Is there anything that you know of that's happening now?
Absolutely. I think that's a good question. So I'm not sure whether a lot of people know about this, but AI has played a critical role so far in fighting against COVID. And so AI has been developed in several ways. So the first way AI, so we've seen several hospitals around the world using AI to basically to analyze the CT scans, so they can spot, COVID on the chest CT scans. And that was using, deep learning and, computer vision and image recognition to do that. So that's in diagnosing the patient. Once the patient had been diagnosed, then the next bit AI has been used was for triage. And this is really important. So if you have a health system that is really struggling, with its capacity, it's important to do a triage. So you know which one is very critical and which one, is not that critical, because the unfortunate story with COVID that we have seen is that there are like some patients who basically don't really suffer from COVID, and then you have the other end of spectrum where like people are really dying from COVID. So you really need to do a triage to know which one to prioritize. So AI has been used to do the triage of patients. Another application we've seen, I mentioned, for example, robots and drones, for example, robots, doing the PCR test, because they, to minimize the risk of infection. But we have also seen drones, deployed outside to see whether people are adhering to the, 2 meter here we have in the UK distance between kind of two people. And then another very famous example of using AI is, I know that you guys in the US, Moderna has been already used. So it is important to mention that Moderna has used AI to come up with the vaccine. So they have used AI to analyze the sequencing of the mRNA, because there have been kind of like a huge number of sequencing, and they use AI to help, sort out, which sequencing to focus on.
That's fantastic. Well, yeah, that's awesome. Dr. Djamila, I want to thank you for being on Data Talk again and sharing so many of your wonderful insights with us. I've taken tons of notes. So thank you for being on the show. Before we go, can you share with everyone how they can get in touch with you and also more about the consulting services you provide?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Destiny. It's always a pleasure to be, with you guys. Always have a very good, conversations. Um, so I'm very happy if people would like to get in touch through LinkedIn. You can find me in there. My company is called MindSenses Global. So it's an AI management consultancy. So our main mission is to help businesses and organizations apply AI. And the way we do it, we offer education. So we educate the business executive in terms of what is AI and how AI can help them. We conduct a strategic insight in terms of how they could adopt and deploy AI in their particular sector. We also have the capabilities to build the machine tools. Another area we help with is to do with, because there is a lot of hype around AI. So even if you are like a VC or a family investor, if you are looking to invest in AI, you could struggle to find which AI startup to invest in. So, for example, we have some of the statistics here in the Europe. There have been a recent survey that says basically 40% of European AI startups do not actually use AI. So they're only jumping on the AI hype to get more investment. So what we do is we give independent advice to investors in terms of AI trends and which AI to start up to invest in or not. So those are the ways on how we are helping businesses, and people can find more information at www.mindsenses.co.uk.
Awesome. That is fantastic. Yeah, and we'll make sure to link on our Experian news blog. We'll put the show notes and the link in the podcast as well as on YouTube. So everyone go search for Mind Senses Global to learn more about Djamila. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Data Talk podcast. We share new shows every week, and you can find the full catalog of previous episodes, including YouTube videos, on our Experian news blog. You can get access to the full catalog by going to Experian.com/DataTalk. And we always love hearing from our community, so if you have any comments or suggestions for future shows or guests you'd like to hear from, please let us know. You can leave a comment on iTunes, or you can reach out to us on Twitter at Experian Data Lab. You can also email me directly. My email is michael.delgado@experian.com. Take care, and we'll chat next week.